Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the 6th annual Getting Played Symposium on Equity in the Entertainment Industry and Awards, hashtag Getting Played Symposium. I am Kathleen Tarr, the founder of the Symposia and today's moderator. This is the first Getting Played Symposium exclusively hosted in virtual space, so bear with us. Still, gratitude to the Ohlone, the original inhabitants of the land I am currently occupying here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Some logistics. The recording of this symposium may or may not be made available after the event, so don't go anywhere. You don't want to miss anything. And although it likely goes without saying, all participants' opinions are their own and do not represent their employers or the symposium sponsor, Stanford University's program in writing and rhetoric. Thank you, Power, for sponsoring these annual symposia since their inception. In the interest of time, we will be limiting our introduction of panelists, so please read their full bios on the Getting Played Symposium website. You may be wondering at this time of pandemic, why is equity in the entertainment industry paramount in this moment? Well, we needn't look much further than the headlines to make that connection. Asians in the United States are being violently targeted regardless of ancestry. The assaults stoked by politicians who intentionally speak of SARS-CoV-2 as the Chinese virus. Seniors are being told it is better for them to die than for a clearly problematic economic system to falter. And when a choice that will hopefully never come demands a decision between who will be provided life-saving medical support and who will be left to die. An article in the Tampa Bay Times a few days ago reports the Florida Bioethics Network guidelines suggest using age of patients as a tiebreaker, giving younger patients priority. If that is not offensive to you, perhaps you should deliberate the ethics of prioritizing female COVID-19 patients over males who face a higher mortality rate, a suggestion that has not arisen in guidelines for the obvious reason that males, even if more susceptible to the illness, are nevertheless deemed equally, if not more worthy of life, whereas older people are not. Not so for people with disabilities either, who have already had to fight in the courts for protections against protocols that would rob them of care during this pandemic. And then, of course, there are these other horrifying disparities. Navajo Nation has a greater per capita incidence of COVID-19 than all US states but New York and New Jersey, and an infection rate 10 times higher than neighboring Arizona. In New York City, the virus is twice as deadly for Black and Latinx people than whites. African Americans are dying at much higher rates in every state, not just because of historic racism and comorbidities, but also because of what we're not supposed to say out loud. That medical workers who are, yes, to be thanked for working on the front lines of this pandemic, are study after study proven to be biased to the cost of higher mortality rates in Black and other marginalized patients. In England as well, people from minority groups appear overrepresented among novel coronavirus deaths by as much as 27%. Michael Harriot tweets, "It's irresponsible to write coronavirus is killing Black people without explaining why, and we know why." He continues, poverty, medical redlining, doctor bias, profiteering. It's like reporting for some reason Black people keep dying when the cops show up. You have to say why. So I'll say it. I'll add to that list employment discrimination in the entertainment industry. That discrimination shapes who we see on the big and small screens and on stages throughout this country and in many parts of the world, which in turn shapes who we deem a perpetual foreigner, a throwaway, an object, at best a supporting character in the narrative of our day-to-day lives. The statistics about disparities in entertainment hiring have been well known since the Screen Actors Guild casting data reports were made available in the last millennium, and long before that by anyone paying attention. The question is and continues to be, what do we do about it? The efforts that get the most attention request that Hollywood and the entirety of the entertainment industry regulate themselves, get their own house in order from within. Some of these efforts have shown a degree of success, such as gender parity in children's television finally being reached last fall, following gender parity for screen time and speaking time, which was achieved in children's television back in 2011. And we should celebrate. But we also should not ignore that parity achieved represents advancements for white women and girls. And in other media outside of children's television, equity for even that demographic has not been attained, as neither across races, for people with disabilities, and for all those at the intersections above and below the line. the industry's employment numbers have real impact. Gina Davis famously said, "Media can be the cure for the problem it's creating." But what is also true is that the most successful civil rights movements in the United States have required a collaboration, one that includes consumers and lawyers. In most of the talk about ushering in equity in the entertainment industry, litigation outside of sexual harassment remains taboo. That's what we're going to talk about today. The case law centering the entertainment industry is, for the most part, infuriating, with one decision acquiring most of the spotlight, Lyle v. Warner Brothers, an employment discrimination case of almost 15 years ago, which we will hear more about in a moment, filed by Amaani Lyle, a writer's assistant on the extremely popular television show Friends. Of note is an amicus brief that was filed with the Supreme Court of California representing the Writers Guild of America West, the Directors Guild of America, the Screen Actors Guild, and 131 named individuals representing a who's who of television and motion picture writers and directors, including Norman Lear, whom I admire so deeply, asserting that a writer's room requires that they can share their most private and darkest thoughts without concern for ridicule or embarrassment or legal accountability. That brief and the eventual 2006 decision by the California Supreme Court felt like betrayal. It denied Amaani Lyle a trial. It robbed a jury of making a finding. I am glad we have with us today two authors of amicus briefs in the Lyle appeal that argued in favor of her claims. We are so lucky to have in conversation panelists Elizabeth Kristin, Russell Robinson, and Sarah Moshman, who I want to thank profusely for their participation under these challenged circumstances. I also want to thank award-winning magician Christian Kajigal, who will end our program, yes, you heard that right, with magic. We want to make sure that even when we are thinking of the entertainment industry, we aren't limiting ourselves to Hollywood. And I'm pretty sure we're going to need something uplifting and encouraging in 90 minutes time. I also want to thank Lisa Wentz, author of Grace Under Pressure, for her contributions to prepping for this event, Chris Roseville for providing tech and other support every year of the Getting Played Symposium, What the Productions, Novel Approach, and formal panelist Adrienne Anderson of both Black Laurel Films and American Royalty, because frankly, I do not know how I would have gotten through these days without her, African Chai. And no, the product placement is not paid advertising, I just love it. We will unfortunately not be joined today by special guest Amaani Lyle, but we do nevertheless get to hear from her in this clip from Sarah Moshman's 2020 documentary called Nevertheless. There's some strong language, so viewer discretion is advised. We thank Amaani for her service. So apologies to everyone for the tech problems. Okay, Sarah, so let me ask you, the film is so good. What made you decide to include Amaani Lyle's story in your documentary?
Thank you for having me today. I'm very honored to be part of this. You know, as someone who works in the film and television industry, I definitely wanted to showcase a story from that realm, but I didn't want to focus on what we kept hearing about in the media, which, as we all know, was prominently about white, actresses, very famous celebrities. But my personal experience and every one of my colleagues and friends, mostly the women, had experienced sexual harassment in so many different forms at nearly every job they had taken part in. And so I thought, well, where are our stories collectively? And I had heard a little bit about Amaani's story in passing. It's very infamous in the film industry, and I didn't know anything about the legal side. But I just sort of always heard about Lyle versus Warner Brothers, and that this one writer's assistant stirred up trouble. And I just remembered that in our research process, and so looked further into it and reached out to Amaani, and she was so warm and lovely. And the more that I learned about the story, the more angry I got. And I wondered, which I hope we're going to talk about too, is what would be the case today? Would the results be different now that everyone is aware of MeToo and so many stories have unfolded over the past few years and then some? It just begged the question, would things be different today? And so talking with her was incredibly enlightening and so familiar, even though our careers were, a decade apart. It just felt like everything she went through, we've all gone through in some form. And it was so great to hear that she stood up for herself, because so many of us don't. So, yeah.
And do you think it would be different today?
I've been thinking about this at length, and in some ways I think the outrage would be more public, and that people could get behind her on Twitter and on social media, which didn't exist at the time. So I think that part of it would be louder. But ultimately, I think our legal system hasn't changed even an inch, perhaps, since this. So I think the result might be the same, but the journey would be different. But I think of shows even like on HBO, like Veep, for example. I'm a big fan of the show Veep, and I think about what must that writer's room be like? It's incredibly offensive language to everyone. And what are the pretenses that those writers come into that writer's room with? Like, what does that look like? What is their sexual harassment training? Like, how do we, I don't think this is a perfect yes, no, black, white issue, but I think so many things went wrong for Amaani, and it isn't fair that her career was completely derailed and we don't have her voice, her art, you know, her work showcased on television and in film for years after. So I'm not sure, and I'd love to hear what the other panelists think, but I'd like to hope that the journey at least would be different and she'd have a lot more support, because at the time she felt very alone.
Yeah, absolutely. So Professor of Law, Russell Robinson, so the same questions to you, really. Would you, first of all, why did you feel the need to write an amicus brief? And then do you think that the result would be different today?
Yes, so thanks for having me, and thanks for highlighting this really important case and very important issue. I wanted to get involved because I was very concerned that, as I saw it, there was this tension between two important values. One, equality, equal treatment in terms of sex, gender, and race in the workplace. But on the other hand, creative freedom, that we know that to create a show like Sex and the City, for example, you have to talk about sex. Like, there's sort of no way to do that and not talk about sex in a way that wouldn't be appropriate if you were at a law firm, for example. So I argued that there was a need to balance these two interests and to try to protect both creative freedom and equality in the workplace. And I was very worried that the California courts would be really focused on the entertainment impact and the industry impact, and not so much the individual, the woman on the ground like Amaani Lyle. And so I thought she needed support and people on her side to say, hey, equality matters too. You can't sort of have an exception for an industry just because we all like Friends and Sex and the City and these other TV shows that include sexual content. So I wanted a more nuanced, balanced approach. That didn't happen. The opinion is very one-sided, very much in favor of corporations like Warner Brothers, as opposed to individual rights. So I wanted to have a voice and hope to make a difference. I'm not sure that I did, but it is exciting to sort of see how things have changed somewhat since then.
Yeah, absolutely. So Elizabeth Kristin, you're an attorney with what is now Legal Aid for Work, but back when the brief was written, it was Employment Law Center. So same sort of questions. What made your organization and you decide to write it? And then do you think it would be different today?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks, Sarah, for that beautiful film. I loved seeing Amaani Lyle, you know, in person, as close as we ever see anyone in person these days. And I was just struck again by what a brilliant, courageous woman she is, and you know, what a creative voice we lost in this industry. I mean, thank her for her service to the Air Force and to our country, but you know, she clearly had a gift and a calling to that industry. And even at the time, you know, I went back and reread our brief and looked again at the opinions. You know, I was a kind of a new baby lawyer at the time. I graduated from Berkeley Law in 2001, and I started working in our gender equity and LGBTQ rights program on sexual harassment cases. So any case involving sexual harassment was of interest to me at that time. But when I heard about this case, I was, first of all, completely shocked and outraged by the facts. I think hard for people today to know how important the Friends TV show was at the time. I mean, it was a really culturally dominant show that was on in prime time, that really a lot of people watched. And so, and I never saw it as the kind of show that was sexually explicit, or you would be hearing this kind of offensive stuff in the writer's room. So the facts themselves just shocked me and were appalling to me. And then the fact that we have this African-American woman trying to hold accountable this incredibly big corporation, and what looked like the entire Hollywood industry lined up against her. I mean, and then they were taking what I thought was a completely outrageous position, which we were really worried the court might adopt at the time, which was that this entire industry should be carved out from any kind of accountability for sexual harassment. And not only that industry, but any industry that could in any way deem themselves creative. They were really advocating strongly for this very broad carve out to sexual harassment law. So our organization and a few other nonprofits who weighed in with us were really concerned about this. And I agree with Professor Robinson, and just looking again at the opinion came down, I mean, in some ways it came down in the right way, and that it did not create this carve out that, you know, many in the industry were looking for. But in another way, it's such a narrow opinion. It's such, I feel like, an unfair way of dealing with the compelling facts she had. And then the other thing is that she had a racial harassment claim as well. And the court did not know at all how to deal with a race plus sex harassment claim, what we sometimes call intersectionality. And the courts still don't know how to deal with those claims. You know, they want to like divide up the sex part and the race part and then look at them separately, and they're not really looking at the cumulative impact. So even though I think certainly the MeToo movement, social media, even the law actually has improved a little bit, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I still am not convinced that the outcome would be that different, because I think, as Professor Robinson is saying, there is this tension still between these really important values in California. And so I'm worried that there would still be a lot of push behind the idea that we are somehow restricting free speech or creative expression if we were holding people accountable.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I wanted to pull up the language from the decision itself, because I found this so, I began acting in the late 90s. And so having come there from practicing law as a human and civil rights attorney, I was struck right away with, why is all this employment discrimination just rampantly happening all around me? But the decision, the language of no reasonable trier of fact could conclude these particular comments were severe enough or sufficiently pervasive to create a work environment that was hostile or abusive to plaintiff in violation of the Fair Employment and Housing Act, and that's California's equivalent. And I just found it so outrageous. Like I said in Sarah's documentary, it's so interesting to me, since a lot of the commentary that was happening in the writer's room was dealing with actors by their actual names, for example. So the discussion wasn't, you know, about Courtney Cox's character, Monica Geller. It was about Courtney Cox and some of the other actors who were involved. And so already it's like, well, it's not really about character development, plus telling Amaani not to take notes, right? All of that. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about the ways in which, because there are a couple cases, and certainly Sarah, you can speak to too, I think, about how the industry works with packaging and greenlighting as well. But I was thinking of a couple of cases with I think it was strippers actually in San Francisco. I can't remember the name of the club, but they actually, African Americans sued to get a better time when more clients were available, and they won. Or you have Hunter Tylo, who was on Melrose Place way back in the day, and she was fired when she got pregnant, and she sued for discrimination, and she won. Or you can think of other industries like Southwest Airlines, and I had to pull up this quote because it's pretty unbelievable. They wanted a policy that only attractive women could be hired as flight attendants and ticket agents. And because they said, and it was a First Amendment artistic freedom argument, they wanted a sexy image that they could project to fulfill its public promise to take passengers skyward with love. Right? But they lost. And I'm just always very curious. And so about everybody's thoughts about why are there certain cases where people seem to understand that entertainment does not let you get away with discrimination in employment. But then there are all these other cases, and certainly Lyle is one of the most upsetting ones, where they just kind of say, no, we're going to give you all the freedom to do whatever you want.
I mean, I wonder if it's impact, or really the cases that you mentioned don't impact as widespread all of the predominantly men, you know, white men that work in these writers' rooms. Like that case would have impacted every writers' room following, you know, for years to come. So I wonder if it's just a matter of what kind of impact. If it's a pregnant person being discriminated against, that's one pregnant person versus an entire industry of people.
And I would add that, you know, law is kind of a mosaic where lower court judges reach different opinions in different parts of the country with different values, different strategies for resolving a case. And so it's not uncommon to have unsettled legal precedents. And I would also add, though, to the list that Kathleen provided the Claybrooks case from 2012 involving The Bachelor. 2 Black men sued and said that they were discriminated against based on their race when they tried to audition for The Bachelor, and they also lost. And the rationale was also sort of creative necessity, First Amendment, you know, you're gonna harm creative freedom. So it's very much compatible with the Lyle reasoning. And so it's unfortunate to me that the law is mixed, but that some of the most prominent decisions like Claybrooks and Lyle have come out against equality.
Mm.
Yeah, would you add anything to that, Elizabeth?
I mean, I would add just the idea that I think her case, while disappointing, I think it probably did impact the industry, even though she didn't win. And certainly, I think the laws have tightened a little bit, and with the attention paid with the Me Too movement, I do think that, you know, employers have to do training, employers have to be, you know, looking out for this kind of stuff. I don't know that the actual day-to-day experience of the writers' room has changed appreciably. I'd like to think that it has. But I don't think that they got off completely scot-free, in the sense that I think this was a wake-up call probably to the industry. And it, you know, I think it had to have had some impact that she, you know, stood up and took this all the way to the California Supreme Court and shone a light on this. I mean, I know some of you are really deeply steeped in this industry, but for someone like me who's just really a consumer, this wasn't something that I knew about or thought about or had even had on my radar, that, you know, something like 99% of comedy writers were white men, and that this whole comedy genre that I really enjoyed was really being written in this terrible way. And no wonder it wasn't more inclusive. So I don't know, I'd like to think that it had some impact on, you know, people like me, but also on the industry itself.
I really liked what Amaani said in the video about Me Too, that, you know, when it was, you know, Angelina Jolie and Gwyneth Paltrow complaining about harassment, suddenly it was like a new story and it became a movement. But, you know, 20 years earlier, it wasn't treated the same way. And I feel like that has played out at many different levels with Me Too, that the type of woman that experiences discrimination, her race, her class, those things matter in terms of whose story matters. But I do think that Me Too has changed the awareness. And so I think the changes that are happening in some entertainment companies are driven more because of social movements like Me Too, Time's Up, and Black, I want to say Black Lives Matter, but Oscars So White. Right? That sort of those movements, I think, have meant more than the law, in that now, like, you are hearing reports of showrunners being fired for abusive language, for sexual harassment. And so it seems that in some cases now, I presume with legal advice, companies are saying, we would rather fire even a lucrative showrunner than deal with the risk of legal claims and also the social media fallout from hiring somebody who's known to be a harasser. So it does feel like things are changing somewhat. One of my friends is a writer in Hollywood and is gay and Latino, and he spoke in my class a couple of years ago, and he said, it feels like right now, the industry, when it comes to anti-discrimination, is like a salad bowl. And as a writer, you never know if you're going to work in a company where it's like been coated in this new dressing of equality, or it's going to be like the old style uncoated leaf, and you're going to be subject to the same norms. And so it's very uneven, he said, but there are signs of change. It's just not uniform.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking, as you were saying, combining all of your answers really and thinking about who's prominent and whether we pay attention depending on who, because I'm thinking Hunter Tylo was a white female actor. And you may, I'm sure all of you have noticed that when actors get pregnant in productions, they're not fired, right? They might be hidden behind a lamp or something like that.
Laundry basket.
Right, put in a big coat, all of those types of things. And I'm wondering what the connection is between her successful lawsuit, Hunter Tylo's successful lawsuit then, and the idea that, okay, well, we can just dress up people's pregnancies rather than fire them because there was such a big cost attached to that. I wonder too then where casting is concerned, because that seems to be even the harder part, even though below the line is still a really difficult place to find equity. In casting, it seems like that's the harder place for people to really believe that your demographics should not determine the role you get to play. And I'm wondering where you guys think, do you think that there's, you know, like the bona fide occupational qualification, which says you may, you know, for race, you can never use that. It's a never bona fide reason to deny someone a position, which would go to the Claiborne case. Right? Like African Americans who are, hey, the Bachelor doesn't have us as leads, and that just gets thrown away as if BOFQ doesn't exist. And then it's supposed to be for gender only when necessary, or sex only when necessary, right? So I'm wondering, do you all think, Sarah, as someone in the industry, and then Russell and Elizabeth as attorneys, do you think there is no line that's different for other businesses in that regard, or should there be some leeway given for casting?
Yeah, I don't know. Casting is very tricky because we'd like to think that there could be some kind of blind casting process where only the best person is chosen, but inherently it also is a very visual medium. So while I'd like to think that we could just choose the best actor for the part, sometimes you're telling a story of a certain period, which I feel like sometimes is an excuse for racism to, choose a certain period to be working within. But also maybe you're telling a story of racism, so you need to be able to cast the actors based on their race for that reason. So it's complicated, but I would like to hope that casting directors have a better awareness that they're really the first stop, of what directors are seeing, what networks are seeing, who's coming through the door, and hopefully more talents are being celebrated rather than objectifying women. These casting couches of women coming in and having to wear bikinis and being judged on their bodies, like, that's terrible, and that's not the kind of media that we want to see more of. So I would hope that casting directors maybe go through some kind of training as well to undo some of these biases that we all carry, so that they're really the first line of defense of what we're going to see in our media ultimately.
I agree with that, and I would add that I argued when I wrote about this, I think it was in 2007, that entertainment companies should distinguish between storylines that are interwoven with race and gender, like a film like Crash, for example, which is about race relations. Like, you have to take race into account in casting a movie like that. But a show like Friends doesn't need to be race-based. I mean, you could have a Black friend, an Asian friend, without it disrupting the storyline. And so my argument was that there were too many instances where there was this default assumption that a white male had to be, especially the lead, that actually demonstrating that was necessary to the storyline. What I think we've seen change since then is less of a huge move towards sort of colorblind casting and more of criticism of when studios cast white actors for playing characters that are people of color. Right, so Scarlett Johansson, Emma Stone, there's been huge flaps on social media, and by and large, usually those films have flopped. Like, there's been a price that studios have paid at the box office, and now I think that they're more hesitant to do that. And again, that's social media instead of the law making a real difference in terms of the visibility and the backlash, which ultimately harms the bottom line.
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the things that I wonder if it's true, and you all could probably speak to this more than me, is whether having these new kinds of streaming media has opened up more room for more diverse storylines. And so I feel like, I don't know that I'm seeing more diverse casting necessarily, but I feel like I'm seeing more stories about people of color cast with people of color, where stories are being told that are different than I've seen. I'm thinking of, like, the new remake of One Day at a Time, Hentified. These are some really amazing stories that are out there that I don't think we would have seen had there not been streaming media. But I'm sure there's lots of problems with the streaming media world as well. So I don't know if you all have thoughts on that, if that's made a difference, good or bad, or it's pretty much the same.
It seems like it's a very positive impact. I mean, Netflix is really leading the charge with hiring female directors. So there's definitely more opportunity for creators in general because there's so many increased platforms. And I agree. I feel like we're seeing a really exciting influx of diverse voices, certainly not at an equal level, but I think that it's really gone out of style to just have the all white cast or the, white male protagonist. I hope that people are becoming more media savvy and aware, even as consumers, because they really have the power. We all do with our dollars, with our remote, where we choose to stream. That's really where the change is going to happen, is actually watching the content from the diverse voices and needing more of that. So I think it's an exciting time, but we can't, let go of the issue and continue to fight for it.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think as the industry has expanded because of streaming, we're seeing also the rise of creators, Black folks, women of color, people like Ava DuVernay, Janet Mock, right, that have big deals at studios and can greenlight shows and tell stories that we've never seen before, right? So I think there is a huge change happening in the business, and it's that these folks have power to cast who they want and to tell stories that weren't permitted before.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How do we make sure so it's a sort of a compound question about leveraging consumers in this effort. But also making sure, so for example, Thor, Ragnarok, which was discussed how diverse it was and how, you know, fantastic it was. But if you really scrutinize it, the leads were still white, still male. And it was, so some of the argument is about the efforts now are to populate the background with people of color, but they still aren't actually getting to be the leads, which sends society and sends us this message that people of color and women and disabled, they're actually just background characters. The leads are always these white males. And even the inclusion rider, which is much, you know, much touted, it doesn't touch white hero at all. It only talks about supporting characters. It does so in a way that I think actually violates discrimination law because it brings in quotas. And it also doesn't measure, you know, it says, it talks about the character as a way of trying to decide whether a project is compliant or not versus actually hiring actors. So I'm not, you know, that's just one example, but I'm wondering then, is that actually just more of an example of how the public thinks, right? Which is we're not really noticing ever when we're put in the background as people of color or women or disabled, like we're not actually knowing, and we're still getting that reflection, as Gina Davis says, something that feeds on itself. It's sort of a long question, but if anyone has any thoughts, please.
Well, I share your skepticism of the prioritization of inclusion writers. So when Frances McDormand a few years ago at the Oscars championed them, suddenly the term went viral and what's an inclusion writer? I want an inclusion writer. And I thought, you know, it's not nothing, but it still is assuming it's only about casting secondary roles, right? Oftentimes background sort of walk-ons, right? And so it's great to give folks some money and some job, but it's not the same as casting the lead, right? And so it feels like it sort of builds on the long-standing trope of white male centrality, and then you just kind of use folks of color, women as background flavor, and that feels subordinating to me. So I do think we have to go beyond that. We are seeing, though, what do they call gender-flipped TV shows, like there's a Hulu one with Zoe Kravitz, Regina King in Watchmen, but we're also seeing backlash, right? Internet trolls, I think usually white men, that are upset that their characters are being turned into women of color. And sometimes not supporting them, like the Ghostbusters remake with women. So I think there's still conversation going on, and it's not absolutely clear that gender flipping, for example, will be a profitable model going forward, especially when it's sort of a genre that depends on the fanboys, and that term is, I think, intentionally gendered, who can reject it if they feel like, you know, they're not seeing people who represent them.
Where does that, because the question made me think of, you know, so much of entertainment requires a willing suspension of disbelief, right? You cannot, you're watching fake sets, you're watching fake costuming, you're watching, you know, one actor, if we're thinking of Meryl Streep, she's playing a witch, she's playing a prime minister, like she's, you know, all these things, and we have to suspend disbelief in order to enjoy it. When you're talking about the trolling and the pushback and some of the resistance, is it because we have not really learned how to suspend our disbelief around our stereotypes and biases about certain roles? And how can law, because that's what we're talking about, how can litigation actually push that edge, and how has it done for other industries? You know, how has the Fair Employment and Housing Act and the EEOC and all the agencies that enforce discrimination laws, is there a way to use law to kind of push back on what we know as society? We have a problem with discrimination and bias from all of us about what people's roles are supposed to be.
I think it's really complicated these days, because I feel like with this sort of both sidesism that we now hear all the time in the media, what we get a lot still is this backlash, even in legal settings, you know, this kind of backlash against, you know, if you're doing something for women or for people of color or disabled people or LGBT people, you know, this sort of, you know, centrality of the white cis male who's able-bodied, you know, that is, you know, attacked, or there's some kind of backlash against it. So I think we're still seeing that. I think some of that's driven by the media, some of that's driven by social media. And then the law continues to be a really challenging way to make change. It rests predominantly on individuals taking a stand and going forward. We do have a class action mechanism, certainly, but it's very difficult to use in discrimination cases unless there's some kind of broad-based neutral policy that screens people out. And even then, if you're talking about a part of the industry where women or people of color are in very small numbers, you may not really have enough numbers to show disparate impact. You might not have statistical significance. So it makes it challenging to go forward on that basis. And then someone like Amaani Lyle, I mean, the fact that she was able to pursue and continue with this case when she's one individual, probably paying her own costs to her lawyer, even if she wasn't paying his fees, going forward, trying to work this into her day-to-day work life, and she's someone who at least, clearly is like well-educated, speaks English, has, some resources. A lot of our clients are, undocumented, monolingual Spanish speakers. And then if they go up against their employer, they threaten immigration retaliation. I'm not trying to minimize the cost that Amaani played. I know that was real, but it's just ever so much more difficult for other people too. And so it's kind of a weird system that we rely on individual courage to come forward and take on this societal problem. And we don't really give them a whole lot of support. Organizations like mine, Legal Aid, that provides free legal services for low-wage workers, really rare throughout the country. There's a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers, and a lot of them do amazing, great work and help people, basically for free, especially if they don't win. But it's not easy, and they can't represent a ton of low-wage workers. So I find the whole paradigm really actually more challenging now than I ever did, especially with the Trump judges taking over the federal courts. We're gonna have a lot more difficulty pursuing our federal civil rights. And as I'll get off my soapbox in a second, but probably any week now we're going to have a bad Supreme Court decision on LGBTQ rights, and we're going to kind of be set backward again in so many of these areas. So the law is frustrating that way. It does move forward. I think we have pushed it. California is leading in a lot of respects, but it's still really not a very effective system for combating discrimination.
Well, and I would add at the cultural and psychological level, it's frustrating to hear the sort of trolls complain about losing a character that they saw as their identity. Who's the Disney princess that's going to be a Black woman? Is it
Ariel?
Ariel, maybe?
Yeah.
There was a lot of backlash about Ariel being Black. And if you're Black, if you're a woman, if you're LGBT, you've always had to imagine yourself in a storyline that isn't built around you. You've never had the luxury of only, I'm a Black gay man, I've never had the luxury of only seeing myself in Black gay characters, because there's so little that I could see myself in, right? So you have to be creative and find a way to relate to it. And so to have, the white man or white woman that's upset about losing Ariel, it's so frustrating, because it's when you've grown up and you're always on the outside, you have to do that all the time, and yet you still find a way to connect, that somebody doesn't have to look like you to be able to identify with them and their journey.
Yeah, I think we're definitely missing that component in the way that we think of others, right? Is that we don't have to look the same or be the same sex in order to relate to someone. And what you were talking about, I was remembering Rue from Hunger Games, which was actually written as someone who was darker. Yeah. And then there was all this trolling about people losing the blonde, blue-eyed kid who had been in their mind, who wasn't actually even described that way in the book. I mean, it's a really interesting way that people create their own narrative and the things that offend them. I think part of what I also wonder so much, and I'll see if I can pull up an image of this actor. This is Ira Aldridge, who he left the States when he was 20 because of the environment here, and he ended up having his big break at Covent Garden. And playing Othello, he stood in for someone who ended up being ill or not being able to do the performance, and then went on after that. People loved him, so he went on after that to play Macbeth and King Lear and all the ones that people in their minds think of as only something for a white male to play. And this was in the 1800s, right? So what is it that's delaying us so much from just being able to see people and to suspend disbelief about the appropriate demographic for someone to play a character? Is it really all just money-based? Is that really where the problem that we're seeing? Is it all based in green lighting and money?
I wonder about this right now, actually, because of the pandemic, and the box offices are suffering so deeply this year. And I wonder and worry for next year, for this fall, our studio is going to take even less risks than they were before because they need a win, because they need to recoup from all these losses this year. So, I mean, in a tangential way from your question, I just really worry that we're going to take steps back because of this pandemic in so many ways, obviously with our economy, but, you know, with our media, our project's not going to get greenlit that have a person of color as the main character, because that's inherently, sadly, a risk, unless it's based on intellectual property that's incredibly popular already. So that's at least been on my mind, is how do we not, you know, take many steps back with the MeToo movement. I mean, it went like we were talking about MeToo constantly to all of a sudden the news is dominated by the pandemic, as it should be. How do we come out of this and not lose the traction, lose the ground that we've gained with our media, with our characters as well?
That's a great point, because, and I'm sure Elizabeth knows this, the saying "last hired, first fired."
Yeah.
That, like, people who just got in the industry are the most vulnerable when there's a pandemic and there are fewer movies made, or what seems to be likely going forward is more films being routed to streaming and fewer going to theaters, and only sort of really big spectacles going to theaters to bring people back into the theaters. And so it feels like there's a risk that there'll be sort of various tiers, and that women and people of color will get to make like smaller budgeted productions, but that it'll be harder and harder to get, be one of the handful of movies that is authorized, you know, at the $200 million level that's going to be shown throughout the country. I think there's a real risk that sort of the white men will hold on to their share, but that the women, the newcomers in terms of directors and writers, will get less.
Yeah.
I was just thinking so much about the echoes we also saw of all this in our political system over the past 9 months. You know, when we started off, the Democratic candidates had this, you know, more than ever diverse field, and then in part because of money and other factors, who do we end up with? The, you know, seemingly safe, you know, older straight white man. And I think we've seen it in other aspects of politics too. You know, the Ralph Northam thing, you know, the whole blackface thing got sort of swept under the rug. It was like, well, Democrats can't afford to lose the state house in Virginia, so, you know, that we got to just compromise on that. You know, kind of Al Franken revisionism, like, oh, we shouldn't have been so quick to get Al Franken to resign. So, I mean, I really do think that when people are scared and when people feel vulnerable, they're much less likely to want to take a risk or to hold true to their values. They're just kind of like, okay, whatever, we just need to have a win. And so I think while at the same time we're seeing a ton of diversity in who's running for office, we're still seeing outcomes not being really what they should be, given how much we're putting into it. So I think it's just sort of an echo of what we're seeing in the entertainment industry, as you two were describing it.
Are there other aspects of entertainment, and I'm thinking of the U.S. women's soccer team, are there other aspects of struggle in the entertainment world that we can actually use to even better leverage Hollywood or stages and that type of a thing? I don't know. I know some of the gritty details about that case, and I know it still has some time before I actually think it's going to go to trial, because they fell down on settlement. But I'm wondering if there's something about that also provides an opportunity.
Yeah, Kathleen and I were emailing about this because I was really struck by some of the public positions that the Soccer Federation took that were just incredibly anti-women positions. And it seemed like they thought they were just going to get away with it, that their lawyers were going to make these summary judgment filings and they were going to go to the courthouse and no one was going to see them. And in this case, I think because the women's soccer team, and I know they're not all white women, but I think sort of the face of women's soccer is white, and because they're so high profile right now, I think the social media firestorm that took over in drawing attention to these really like misogynistic filings had an effect on the case. I mean, the head of the soccer foundation had to resign and be replaced. They changed law firms. So there was really actually some impact from social media translating into impact in the case. Now, I don't know how it will affect the ultimate outcome. And in some ways, I think that's a heartening story of women's power and women's social media support coming forward and maybe making a difference in the outcome of a legal case. But I hadn't really seen anything like that before. It was really extraordinary.
I do wonder, because it is also, as you're saying, such a good example of consumers coming out in support, as well as lawyers, getting a litigation together, as well as just the facts being so clear, right? I mean, the women's soccer team makes more money and it gets more income, I think, than the men's team, which number one shows how deeply ingrained the misogyny is, that even your big money makers, you're not willing to pay out. But I'm wondering too, if the collaboration is something that we can use in other parts of entertainment as sort of the role model of how we actually get something done, right? It's how the Montgomery bus boycott worked, right? It was having consumers and it was having lawyers and it was having this community come together. Is there some way that we can wrangle that type of a collaboration?
I wonder. At least with the only example that comes to mind is when actors tell their salary to their fellow actors. So when a male actor says, well, I'm making this, to his female co-star, and then she can fight for a higher salary based on that. So information is power in Hollywood in every sense. So I don't know what the legal ramifications of that are or how that works with contracts, but I think that's one example that comes to mind of how we can band together and start talking more about the money that we're making, and therefore can fill in the gaps, hopefully, when someone's making significantly less and yet garnering the same kind of viewers and attention.
That's a great point, and reminds me of how there's been a conversation around how actors like Jessica Chastain have been in conversation with Black co-stars and learned that their Black co-stars, even like Oscar winners like Octavia Spencer, were making far less than Chastain was making. And so I hope I don't have these facts wrong, but I think that they were negotiating for a co-starring to co-star in a movie, and they went in together and insisted on parity, when typically Chastain would have been able to negotiate a higher salary than Spencer. And so for her to say, like, I'm going to collaborate with you, and even if I make less, it's more important for me to sort of spend my white privilege, as they say, to make sure that you get an equal outcome in terms of the salary. So that's exciting. I don't know how widely that's happening, but it does feel like seeing a sort of common purpose and not just focusing on what's best for you. And I guess on that front, I will say that I'm worried that I feel like when it comes to race in Hollywood, it's still too frequently a Black-white conversation. Mm-hmm. We don't see Latinx folks in particular making the progress that we see for African Americans. There's been some measure of change for Asian Americans after Crazy Rich Asians, and they still have a long way to go. And African Americans still have a long way to go, but it is sort of stunning, especially given the population representation of Latinos in California, how little entertainment there is that is, casting Latinx actors in the lead. And then there are also studies, including some by Stacy Smith at USC, that have found that Latinas are the most likely to be sexualized, so that when they're cast, they're the most likely to have to pose naked or to be in a sex scene compared to Black women, white women, Asian women.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. You made me think of a couple of things. The first, just so that I won't lose it, but the idea of coming in as a team to collaborate around salaries, ironically, the cast of Friends did that, if I recall correctly, that they all came together to make sure that they all paid the same amount, right, per episode. They all made sure of that. So yes, there are collaborations that could happen. I'm wondering how to make those more popular, right? How to make those more popular. If people are interested, so if you do have folks who are interested in coming together, because I was thinking too, the stats, and Sarah, maybe you know any updated numbers, but in fact, females and males graduate film school at the same numbers, but the numbers plummet for how many women actually get director roles. So even something that's completely, I think Elizabeth, you had said earlier about whether there's the numbers that exist to actually show that there's been a disparate impact. And obviously that gets complicated, because if you don't cast people, even though they may be professional actors, do they get counted in that list if you're not casting them? Or like disabled actors who most annually don't get any work at all. And I think the average, at least a few years ago, was like $5,000 or $8,000 a year was their average income through acting. So would you then consider them not to be part of what you're looking at for disparate impact? Like, so basically, does it feed itself? But I think the bigger question is, how do people get connected? Obviously, it's an industry where people worry about burning bridges. You know, if I sue, I'm not going to get another job. If I even complain, I'm not going to get one. But if they want to find someone, what do they do? Who do they even reach out to?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, as we were even talking about Jessica Chastain and Octavia Spencer, I thought, well, we're talking about the wealthiest of the wealthiest 1% in the entertainment industry. So although I love that example, it also feels like, does that ever trickle down to below the line folks? And as you were saying, Kathleen, I totally agree. I mean, working in television, I definitely felt like if I speak up and complain about any number of things, there's 100 people behind me ready to take my place. So it's not the same as Jessica Chastain, who commands the screen and can, you know, garner so many people to even just buy a ticket to see the movie simply because she's in it. So it feels like a win, and yet a completely other world that she's in and that anyone below the line is in. And so, you know, for female directors, I think it is true that you're coming out of film school, it really is that 50-50, and yet there's such a swift drop off as soon as they graduate. And that, I think, comes from any number of factors. I mean, imagine Amaani Lyle. I think of her. She walked into that writer's room after sending out 150 resumes. She got that big opportunity. And what does she find? You know, racial discrimination, incredibly offensive language, a hostile work environment. That would deter anybody from continuing on in that career path. If she's looking at 30, 40 years of that behavior, who wants to put up with that? So even though she would have persisted had she won the case and continued writing, you know, I think it's just only natural for women, especially women of color, to say, this isn't worth it. You know, I want to have a family. I want to have a balanced life. I want to have good mental health. So it's a really tough path out there for those that aren't cisgendered, able-bodied white men to find their way in this business. And yet I'm finding, in a very ironic, frustrating way, a lot of pre-pandemic, a lot of my white male counterparts would say things like, oh, well, there's so many, they're only staffing up with women right now, or these writer rooms are only staffing up with people of color, so I don't have the opportunities I used to. And it's like, how do you even respond to that without losing your mind? There's definitely an expectation. Even on Facebook the other day, there was an announcement that Ava DuVernay is supporting women of color filmmakers, and a white woman responded like, oh, enough already with the women of color. And I was like, oh no. So it's we're not there yet with understanding all of the privileges and biases that stand in our way, all of us in different ways. You know, I certainly have plenty of privileges as a white woman, and yet I don't have the same privileges as a white, able-bodied, cisgendered male. But recognizing that and making the most room possible for any woman of color in the same position that I might be trying to get into, I never think twice about a grant or anything that's meant for a woman of color. That makes complete sense to me, but it doesn't to everyone. So it's a tough balance.
You reminded
me. It's in part like a collective
Elizabeth.
action problem. I'm sorry, Kathleen.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say it's partly a collective action problem, I think. And, you know, this would be a place where, in theory, you know, our unions could be incredibly helpful, you know, to say, look, it's one for all and all for one, and we're in this together, and we're going to look at everybody on this whole production, and we're going to make sure there's no sex harassment and no discrimination, and we're going to really fight for you. But I know that's not necessarily how it works in practice. And I just think, in a way, how alone Amaani Lyle was. I mean, the conduct she complained of was directed at, you know, Courtney Cox. It was directed at is it Martha Kaufman? You know, I mean, they were calling her, you know, the C word, and she had to ban that. Like, oh, well, don't use it to refer to me. Well, why weren't those people involved in helping Amaani Lyle? I'm sure there's a lot of, you know, cultural reasons in Hollywood for why they weren't, but that to me is where the collective action really should take place. And it carries over to other workplaces too, you know, like women working in office buildings, and you know, the female janitors being sexually harassed or assaulted, and maybe you were there that night and you could have helped somebody if you'd been paying any attention. I mean, it's not only women's problems, of course, we all should be doing that, but I do think there are certain kinds of work that's invisible to people who are more privileged and more powerful, and that's a problem collectively.
And I think what I'm hearing from both these last few comments is how it's very much a structural problem. And just to put a couple of more structural pieces on the table, Hollywood is incredibly competitive. there is a sense of that it's zero sum, and that if women of color get more jobs, white women are getting fewer, right? And so when you have people talk about equality, I'm reminded of when Viola Davis became the first Black woman to win Best Actress in a Drama at the Emmys. Nancy Lee Grahn, a white actor, tweeted something about, it was the equivalent of like, enough with the diversity already, right? And sort of like, that's the reaction, not like, thank goodness after 100 years of Black women won, it's already too much. When Hollywood started trying to cast more Black actors and other actors of color after Empire broke out, there was a Deadline Hollywood story about sort of white actors can't get work anymore. And so you go from no opportunity for actors of color, and then it flips, and suddenly, supposedly, the norm is reverse discrimination against white actors. So that's like just the limited way that we think about job opportunity, and that's so rare to think about working across identities and trying to advance equality, even if that means that have fewer opportunities because I have relative privilege compared to somebody else. But I think you're also going back to the Jessica Chastain scenario. You need relationships with people of other identities to even be able to share information with them. And what was so striking to me when I lived in LA and was connected to people in Hollywood was how racially segregated it was, that like most Black actors didn't have a lot of white friends where you would even be able to talk about income and how much you're making, right? Which is, of course, a very personal thing that most folks aren't comfortable sharing what they're being paid, right? And so you don't even have a social network where you would feel safe sharing that information with somebody and have confidence that if you share it with her, she would actually be concerned and want to negotiate to make sure that you're paid equally. So there are just so many like structural impediments where you even get to the place where two people who have different identities would actually go to the table and try to negotiate an outcome that's fair for everybody.
Well, we are, one of the things that we haven't brought up yet is just how much we are missing Amaani's writing. She is hilarious. I mean, she is so funny, and she completely left the industry, right? So we are missing her contribution to our collective sense of, humor. But I was thinking too about the limited opportunities and the limited numbers. But I do feel like, I have worked with so many amazing directors and crew. I mean, there have been some that are a little sketchy, but most of them I've been really, really lucky to work with great people. And I know all these wonderful writers who don't get to work. I'm going to give a plug to Michael Gene Sullivan, who wrote the version of 1984 that's now making stages all over the place. He's a fantastic writer. And he pitched this Duke Ellington biopic and was told he needed to write in a part for Scarlett Johansson, right? Or a type like her. I think actually maybe specifically her, but it was, and this has happened before too, and continues to happen. There are so many great scripts that are inclusive. There are so many directors and producers and people who are totally happy to diversify their sets, and they're still having trouble getting in. So of course there are people who are good, and that you have to talk about what the limited numbers are, but I feel like we could at least agree, couldn't we, to push out some of the more problematic directors and producers and usher in this available, wonderful group of people who could give us more diverse things. But I do wonder, Elizabeth, as you're saying, with the courts as they are now, what are the paths to do that at that point? So what are the solutions to kind of turn around the industry so that we're not talking about how to convince those people at the head to become more, open-minded, but actually maybe to move in more people who actually are thinking the way that most of us want them to think? What are the avenues for us to do that?
Yeah, I know I focused a lot on kind of the bad news, but I think the good news is that California courts have become more diverse, the bench has become more diverse, and California law has become more protective, in large part in response to the MeToo movement. And so in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen California anti-sexual harassment law expand. They've expanded the statute of limitations to be 3 years instead of 1 year, which is huge because not everyone's ready after a year to go ahead and pursue a lawsuit. They've done some work with respect to undoing some of the bad precedent. They've said like one incident of sexual harassment might be enough, that, you don't just get kind of like a free pass if you've sexually harassed someone. They've tightened up training requirements. They've expanded definitions around, other categories. Like, we have some much better protections out there now, and some guidance from the Fair Employment and Housing Commission on transgender workers and misgendering. There are some like now protections for traditional Black hairstyles. So the laws continue to expand and improve, and on paper is awesome. But I still feel like the day-to-day challenges of bringing these cases for at least my kind of clients, still hugely challenging.
I just want to mention that, Elizabeth, what you were talking about is very relevant to the film as well. We follow the passing of SB 1300 in California as part of Nevertheless. And the case I think you were referring to, we also spotlight in the film. It was a 911 dispatcher in California, Patricia Brooks.
Right.
He one night was groped by her supervisor when no one else was around. And she was immediately demoted, and he was not fired. And it ended up being a criminal sexual assault case. But when she took it to the Ninth Circuit Court in California, she did not win because the Judge Kaczynski was one of the presiding judges, determined that the case did not meet the legal standard of severe or pervasive behavior, even though 17 years later, he had to step down, that same judge, because of his own sexual harassment allegations due to MeToo, and he was able to retire with a full pension. And Patricia, same as Amaani Lyle, had to completely switch careers, didn't get her pension, didn't get to, cash in on her retirement. And her life was completely derailed by one groping. And she always determines that it wasn't the grope itself. She's like, I'm strong, I can handle that. It was everything that came after, and how everyone in her life turned against her. And the court ultimately decided. So the law matters so much. And luckily, and in part of the film, we meet with some of the advocates as well. And on January 1st, 2019, finally, SB 1300 was updated to further define severe or pervasive. So even just those words matter so much, and how they're interpreted. As a regular citizen, I was just very surprised to hear that that's how it worked.
I teach that case, and it is incredibly disturbing, right, that you have a judge with a history of harassment.
Yes.
Hearing a harassment case, minimizing the harm. It was just one incident, right? So you can handle it. It's not that bad, right? I mean, how many cisgender straight men can really understand what it's like as a woman to be groped in the workplace? Like, I just don't think most men would understand it, and then certainly not somebody who was himself a perpetrator of harassment. And I'm sure he's not the only federal judge that has ruled in harassment cases that is himself a harasser, right? So you can just sort of see, and it's also really hard to hold a judge responsible. For example, if you're a law clerk and you are harassed by a judge, that judge can make or break your career. You need his recommendation for all subsequent jobs. And so there's so much pressure on a clerk to suffer in silence. And so, even though Kaczynski was revealed and stepped down, I think we can assume that there are many judges like Kaczynski that have not been called out and that continue to rule on harassment cases. So it's just a very flawed system that the judges can use their own life experiences as the baseline for what is acceptable, and that it oftentimes imports a male bias, a heterosexual bias, a white bias, in terms of what is severe or pervasive.
And that's so interesting too, because the legal standard for many years in the Ninth Circuit clearly has said that the victim's experience had to be centered. This idea that it's a reasonable person, a reasonable woman in the position of the victim is supposed to be how you look at this. And yet the judges do kind of continually substitute their own view of kind of, was this offensive? The whole thing with the Lyle case was, one of their issues was, well, they didn't direct it at her, meaning like they didn't look her in the eye and say, Amaani, we're talking about you when we say women are X and women are Y, or, make a joke about Black women. That means you. I was like, I don't know really what they thought she needed to know. She's like the only Black woman in the room. They're talking about Black women. They're talking about her. So that was one of the other things that was really frustrating about that case, was sort of the disconnect between the obvious lived reality that she experienced and described and what the courts took away from it.
Yeah, and back to the Jessica Chastain conversation, like that analysis assumes there's no connection between Amaani Lyle and Courtney Cox, right? When they say something really offensive about Courtney Cox's reproductive capacity, Amaani Lyle shouldn't see that as implicating her, even though they're both women, right? And so that feels like a very sort of male perspective that sees no connection and doesn't understand why Amaani would be upset because of horrible things that were said about Courtney Cox, Jennifer Aniston, Mark Kaufman. Like, they're connected as women, and she understood that to implicate her.
Mm-hmm. Is there a role for politicians to play in all of this? And I'm thinking back to 1969, actually, the hearing chair for EEOC, Clifford Alexander, they found, as after an investigation of Hollywood's practices, they found clear evidence of entertainment industry discrimination in violation of Title VII. And following lobbying by the film industry, Clifford Alexander was called before a Senate Justice Committee where the way that they wrote it, quote unquote, subjected to a tongue lashing for daring to attack these businesses making us so much money, right? And then a week later, President Nixon replaced Alexander. And I'm wondering, because there's such a clear history of wins as far as people in high positions saying, yes, this is discrimination. Yes, this needs to be curtailed. And then somebody pulls the rug out, right? P.J. Sidney, even back in the 1950s, was doing congressional hearings and boycotting and trying to do all this work to integrate and get rid of the de facto segregation, you know, didn't come to much. But I'm wondering then, how do we make sure it sticks? Is there a role for politicians to play that we haven't really tapped into yet?
I think if there is a role, it would need to come from politicians who refuse to rely on high-powered, wealthy donors. So I'm actually writing this week a piece about Mayor Pete Buttigieg and how he powered his campaign. And one of the important planks of his support were white, wealthy gay men in Hollywood. And I think that by contrast, people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were calling out that reliance on wealthy donors. And so I think, you know, in many ways, our politicians, including those, some in California, are compromised if they're relying on donations from Netflix, from, you know, Warner Brothers, Paramount, that, you know, it's unlikely that they're going to be aggressive in calling out discrimination by those companies when they are dependent on them and when the CEOs of those companies are calling them on their cell phone. And so I think it would need to be people like Elizabeth Warren that have said, this is not how we run our democracy. Like, we cannot allow high-powered donors to control policy, to make policy. But I'm pretty skeptical under the status quo that sort of our current California representatives would be empowered enough to anger these really powerful, wealthy donors.
Yeah, I would just say that we need more women and people of color in positions of leadership across the board, especially in politics. I've been very inspired by AOC and even the way that she fights for one fair wage because she herself was a waitress. I mean, that is so novel to have someone in that position in politics say, hey, I've been there not too long ago, and this is why this matters. I was just speaking with the woman who runs One Fair Wage, Saru, yesterday, and she was saying that AOC even talked about how it depended on what day of the month that it was based on how close she was to paying her bills, of how much harassment she would put up with at work. So if it was close to the first of the month, she'd put up with it because she knew she needed to make more tips. If she had just paid her bills, she would say, hey, that's not cool because she had just paid her bills. Like, things like, it was just incredible to hear someone, you know, with that position of power having such firsthand knowledge of what it's like to work in the service industry. So that's just one example to me of how amazing it is when women and people of color fight for our rights and actually reflect the people that they're governing. So it's encouraging to me when women and people of color run, and I hope more of them get into office as things move forward. And maybe that's a Pollyanna view, but that's how I really hope that it continues on, because that's what we need, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, either Elizabeth or Russell, can you think of any other ways to leverage politicians around these issues?
I do think the sort of general improvements in the law, even though they didn't particularly target the entertainment industry, those have been led in part by, the courageous stories that we were just talking about of Ms. Brooks and Ms. Lyle, but also some, great politicians that we have here in California, like Senator Hannah Beth Jackson. So I do think there have been some great leaders in our state legislature. And we have a governor who's willing to sign these kind of bills and kind of forward a women and kind of people of color protecting and advancing civil rights agenda, which we, don't always have, even in California. So I do think that people have been strategic in trying to push forward, these really innovative, advanced ideas in California, both locally and at the state level. I think those are all great. I think targeting that industry in particular is probably going to be challenging for the reasons that Professor Robinson described. This idea of touching this not only like money and politics engine, but also an economic engine in California. I just can't imagine that industry, they're going to put it under the microscope. I think they're going to kind of tinker around the edges, encourage inclusion, but I don't imagine that there would be a specific target. And, you brought up the EEOC, Kathleen. I mean, the EEOC is another agency that has been, to the extent it ever had any fangs, really defanged by the Trump administration. We had a lesbian commissioner on the EEOC who was very forward thinking and advancing LGBT rights under Title VII. They wouldn't renew her, even though she was willing to continue serving, and they're bringing on industry friendly folks and, basically making it challenging to file a charge with the EEOC. We're going to advise our clients to go to the state agency from now on. State law is better, state agency is better, and the EEOC is, I can't say they're shut down. They're not shut down any more than anyone's shut down right now under COVID, but, they're just less effective than they ever have been. And so it's really frustrating. This is like one of the premier civil rights agencies of our entire country, and not effective.
Yeah, I was thinking, obviously the pandemic shuts down a lot as far as the arts and the ways that artists connect to audiences and the way that projects connect. I was thinking though of Naomi McDougall-Jones, who took her film on the road. So she just rented out theaters to show her project and said she made more money that way than she ever had by going through the distribution routes that are traditional. And I'm wondering if there are these untraditional ways that we haven't thought about actually bringing audiences to more diverse and inclusive productions so that they actually bypass the Hollywood system. What's available to us?
Yeah, I think about and talk about this all the time. I know Naomi well, she's wonderful, and she took this joyful vampire tour. So she made a film about vampires. And so instead of trying to go this traditional distribution route where she knew she wouldn't make much, if any, money, she decided to just take her film on the road and do what she called vampire balls alongside a screening of the film. And she made some decent money and through ticket sales and merchandise doing that whole tour. It was, of course, exhausting and expensive to do, but she learned a ton. And I think about this all the time. Nevertheless is my third feature-length documentary, and I have another film that is on Netflix, so I've sort of done things different ways. But what I find with Nevertheless is my focus is really to move the needle and to start continue conversations around MeToo and sexual harassment. And so for us, instead of going more the streaming platform route for now, we're very focused pre-pandemic on going into workplaces and schools and organizations so that perhaps this film could be used as a tool for mandatory sexual harassment training, as something that's more interesting, more cinematic, something that creates a little bit more empathy. And that we have these 7 individual stories, Amaani and Patricia Brooks included, as really case studies of what's happening, so that you learn a story, you feel empathy with an actual human being who went through it, and you're hearing from incredible experts like you, Kathleen, to assess how this impacts our society. So for me, I think about if I just put it up online on iTunes or Amazon, people might click on it, but they might not get enough out of it that I actually want them to get from it. So we have a resource guide and a discussion guide and action plans that go with the film. So I think it's important for any filmmaker to choose what's right based on their film, their strategy, and what success means to them. That might be dollars, it might be views, it might be having that celebrity involved, it might be none of those things, but to get hyper focused on what actually is success for you, and that's going to look different for every filmmaker. So I think the system doesn't feel like it was built for all of us, so it's important to really go out there and create your own system so that we can have sustainable careers. And that's on the tip of everyone's tongue right now in Hollywood, is like, what's going to happen with this pandemic? Is there a possibility for all of us to go back to work in a meaningful capacity? And how do documentary filmmakers like myself continue to make films when they might not be able to have the same path that they once had? So everyone's up in arms right now talking about that. No one has any answers, because we just will have to see. But for me, it's always been about, I don't need all the laurels on my poster or the awards. Like, that stuff is nice, of course. You want to feel accepted and valued, but more importantly, how do you get your film out to the right audiences so that you can actually move the needle?
And one of the resources you connect is the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, correct?
Yeah.
So certainly for sexual harassment, people in the industry and outside, yes, or is it? I think it's outside.
Oh, yeah.
Outside too.
Yeah,
They funded a lot of our cases, Kathleen.
Oh,
it's been
great.
awesome. It's really a beautiful example of the solidarity that we saw. You might remember that farm worker women came out in solidarity with Hollywood women, and I think, kind of to their credit, Hollywood women took up the challenge and created this, multi-million-dollar fund. And many of our low-wage worker cases have been funded with support from Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. So it's a huge resource that's out there, and we're really grateful for it.
That's great.
Well, we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to make sure that in case I didn't ask any questions that you really wanted asked, that you got a chance to say and share your last thoughts. So anyone who's ready to share those last thoughts, please go ahead.
I just want to say thank you to Amaani Lyle. I mean, she's really the reason we're all here today, and I'm just so grateful for her bravery and courage coming forward. I think even though she didn't win her case, we all learned so much from it then and now. So the ripple effects have been felt for decades. I think that's pretty incredible what she's done. Win or lose, Amaani is really a hero.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Can I ask, Sarah, how can we see your whole film? Is it on a streaming platform, or is it available to the public?
So right now we're hosting screenings virtually in workplaces or schools, so anybody can sign up to host a screening. And we're just at neverthelessfilm.com.
Okay.
And so down the road, we'll probably go the digital route, but for now we're working with IndieFlix, and they're a wonderful organization. So we have a whole portal that goes with the film. So it's really like a film-based program, a film-based curriculum. And we have two versions. Amaani's story is featured in both versions, but we have a 50-minute version and an 80-minute version. And we're really hopeful to get this into workplaces and schools as part of their sexual harassment training, or at least conversations.
Great. I will reach out to you to try to schedule something in Berkeley.
Great.
Yeah, I would love to do that as well. I would just say, to the extent there's people here in the audience who are watching who really have already experienced harassment or discrimination at work and feel like, well, I listened to this great whole, production, but I don't really know what I'm supposed to do next because I really need actual practical help. You can certainly contact my organization, Legal Aid at Work. We have a website, legalaidatwork.org. And you can also contact Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. They have a way of connecting you with lawyers throughout the country that are willing to take on these kind of cases. It doesn't mean they can promise that a lawyer will take your case, but you'll get a chance to talk to somebody about it. And so to the extent you need, I need to talk to somebody, I need a practical consult, what am I going to do? I'm in a really bad situation. Those are a couple of resources that I can share, and I know people would be happy to help talk you through your individual personal situation.
That's really wonderful. So thank you all so very much. I could not do this without you, obviously, but I appreciate you just running with it as we had to switch to a virtual world and all that entailed. So much gratitude to you all for joining. The award recipient is unable to participate today, so hopefully we'll be able to bestow the honor upon that person at another event before the year is up. So we're going to give Kristen a few minutes to get himself ready to perform. But I just wanted to thank again. He's ready. I wanted to thank again our sponsor, the Stanford University's program in writing and rhetoric, and to thank all of you who were able to kind of chase down the YouTube live stream and all who joined us on Zoom to watch. I hope everyone that you are well and that you stay well and that you stay home during this most challenging time. And so now it is my pleasure to present Kristen Kajigal.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Russell, don't go away. Panel, stick around. Stick around, panel. Don't. Oh no, the panel went away. The panel went away.
Do you want us to speak to you?
You're gonna be participating. Since,
Oh,
I'm still here, Kristen.
Okay.
So be gentle.
yeah, Russell has to go.
So, and hello to the attendees, the 3 attendees we have here, and the other ones we have on YouTube. I was watching all that going on. Just a quick introduction, because many of you are going, well, who the heck is this guy? My name is Christian Cajigal, or Cristian Cajigal, depending how you voted. Born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, Latinx male. My mom was from El Salvador. And if there's 2 things that Salvadoran mamas are famous for making, it's pupusas and short but handsome men. Kathleen can attest to that in her own way. We won't get into that. It's nothing to do with me. It's not me. It's somebody else. It's another prince. It's not me. Never mind. But yeah, I am an actor and a magician. This conversation, it was very interesting for me, and I'm very grateful for it happening, because I'm learning a lot. And if there's anything that's showing magic tricks, when you're growing up showing magic tricks to your Salvadoran family, you learn that there's 2 kinds of reactions to magic from your Salvadoran family: the suspicious and the religious. My mom was suspicious. She didn't trust anything I said. Every time I showed her magic, she'd go like this. My aunt was religious. She'd call me the devil. Hermana, pero crees que es el diablo. Which is funny when your name is Christian. So I like to show magic to my aunt to this day, just to upset her. Now, during this time of the great pause, I've been doing lots of things. Oh, I've been learning origami, because people think, oh, you're so good with puzzles and origami. No, I'm terrible at origami. But I learned how to make a magic top hat. It's just that. It's cool. You should look it up. It's cool. I've been doing lots of binge watching. I actually, apropos for the talk, I just completely binged all 2 seasons of Star Trek Discovery. Bestest thing ever. And there was not to give too much away, but interdimensionality is a theme. If you've not seen Star Trek Discovery and you just went, oh, the trailer was okay. No, go watch Discovery. It gets deeper. But I thought, let's try a little experiment out with this idea of interdimensionality. I don't know if that's even a word, but I just made it up. We've all seen card tricks, right? Card tricks that involve a whole deck of playing cards. I love how basically we've lost all the attendees on this. A card trick with just 2 playing cards. I'm going to fold 1 card in half just like this. I'll place it right here so you can still watch it. Fold the other card just like this. And slip 1 inside the other. We'll open this up one more time, show you the other side. And now what if we could imagine a little rift in time and space right about there? And you can make that 1 card turn inside out. And outside in. You can get it to go both ways at the same time. Okay, some of you are going, I want to see what's going on inside that other card here. Let me give you a chance to check this out. But what if we could take this little moment of magic and freeze it right about there. And there it is. Time stopped in that moment of magic. Magic. That's is it possible to take this a step further? There's nobody left in the attendees. All the attendees have bailed.
I'm here. I'm here.
You're here.
I'm here. Sarah, she's muted, but she's here.
Sarah, you want to join in with this one? Take that as a no. Sarah's not around.
Do you need another person?
I mean, we're gonna make this work. We're gonna make this work.
Okay.
Okay. I'm learning to make this work with the one person. So.
I'm going to bring you somebody.
Okay.
Oh, hey, we have Elizabeth back.
Oh, hi, Elizabeth.
Oh, good. Good, you have another person.
Yay.
Sorry, my internet dropped.
Oh, no.
Yes, I'm back.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Welcome back.
What'd I miss? There were 2 cards. I'll watch the video.
There was an elephant. It's gone now.
Wow.
There
It was in
like
that top hat, right?
There was a kick line. I swung it on a vine.
I want to be at your apartment.
Right? Right?
Well, what you missed is that you're
fun.
about to become part of the act, Elizabeth.
Okay, let's hope my internet does not go out. All right,
Okay.
I went on my hotspot, so.
All right. Little game of imagination.
Okay.
All right. Take a moment now. You can do this with your eyes open or closed for now. Don't worry, I'll still be here. I'm not going away.
I can't promise.
Anybody who's watching and attending, anybody who's watching this on a stream later on, we don't have to include this in the stream later on. We can just, it's not important. It's not important.
Okay, right, I'm closing my eyes.
Now imagine yourself in an actual room with actual people who
In Spain.
in Spain with this panel, with the people who were watching it, are watching it, will be watching it.
Yes.
Just imagine a little white line going from your right shoulder to the person to the right of you. Now imagine another white line going from your left shoulder to the person to the left of you.
Is it 6 feet apart?
Yes. Because we had not found a vaccine yet. From your chest to the person in front, from your back to the person behind. Now imagine you could float up out of your body and see the scene below. These little lines connecting you to every person on the Zoom, on the internet. And as you go higher and higher out of this imaginary theater in Spain or in your own home, you can see lines connecting you to all the other people on the street. And any one plunk or vibration on this web can be felt on all parts of this web. So maybe knowing what's about to happen next, or the thoughts of the Zoom right next to you, are a simple matter of just listening to your own. Elizabeth, and everybody else, if you're watching, open your eyes. Elizabeth, Kathleen, I've been thinking of a playing card. The two of you are gonna divine what that card is. Elizabeth, do you believe that one card that I'm thinking of is red or black?
Black.
Excellent choice. Kathleen, if it is a black card, is it a club or a spade?
Spade.
Excellent choice. Elizabeth, is it a number card or a court card?
No.
You say number?
Said number.
Number. And Kathleen, which number might that be?
3.
The black 3 of?
Spades.
Spades. I'm going to pull these cards out for the first time.
That's not my card.
It's not. But out of all the cards that are facing you all, only one is facing me.
No.
Is there any possible way you two could have known what card I turned over?
No.
The black three of spades.
What?
The black three of spades.
What? Nice.
Oh my God.
Elephants, fireworks.
That is brilliant. Wow.
Let's take this idea of connections a little step further. All right, Elizabeth. If I had asked you, if you had to choose, what do you believe in more? Luck, chance, or fate? Oh no, we're losing Elizabeth.
No. I put my
Type it in the chat. Type it in the chat.
okay. Watch my mind.
That seems certainly like an answer about fate.
Fate? Okay, don't go away, Elizabeth. We'll let you buffer. Kathleen, luck, chance, or fate?
Fate.
Fate. Why fate?
It's a great word. It seemed to be defining Elizabeth's moment better than the others.
I'm back just in time.
Okay. Okay, Elizabeth, what was your
But now
answer
I
again?
want to change my answer. I feel like now I'm like, I don't know. I thought about it.
So what was it? Luck, chance, or fate?
I picked chance, but I want to change to luck.
To luck.
I don't really know the difference, to be honest with you, but I feel
Okay.
like
What
I'm
made
changing
you?
to luck.
Why luck? What makes you go with luck?
I don't know. I just feel like the randomness of it, that, maybe it can go along with one person, but maybe really you have no control of it.
Okay. Well, Elizabeth, Kathleen, in my hand, I have a handful of luck, or chance, or fate. It's a bunch of ripped up playing cards. And we'll get to why that is the case in a moment. Now I'm gonna just lower the camera here so you can all see my lap and also the table. Okay. Now, normally I would do this with both of you here with me. We can't. So I will be both of yours as hands, okay?
Oh, great.
Elizabeth, would you like me to shuffle these cards or not?
Yes, the shuffle, please.
Want to shuffle some more?
No, that's good.
Do you want to cut?
Yes.
Excellent. Kathleen, do you want me to shuffle?
No.
No. Do you want me to cut? No.
I want it to be left to Elizabeth's doing.
Oh. All right, now I'm going to pull out two special ones just for the two of you. Elizabeth, that'll be for you. And Kathleen, that'll be for you.
This reminds me of the tarot reading I had a few weeks ago.
Did it tell you you were going to be part of a magic?
No, it didn't predict that.
These cards say you're going to be sitting in place for a very long time. Okay, now. Why did my phone ding at me?
I can't really see my card though. Is it a queen of spades?
There's a queen of spades.
Okay, and Kathleen is the queen of hearts? No, queen of diamonds?
King of
diamonds. Got it. Okay.
All right, now Elizabeth, I'm going to slowly deal down through this pile just like this. Whenever it feels right to you, whenever it feels good to you, whenever you want, just say stop.
Okay, stop.
Excellent choice. Kathleen.
Yes.
Just like before, I'm going to slowly deal down through this pile of cards. Right there.
Yes.
My goodness, that was so abrupt. Okay.
She's gaming the system. She thinks
totally
she's messing up your trick.
All right, now. Let's recap. A bunch of choices have just been made. I'm trying to keep these in the camera. A bunch of choices have just been made that have influenced the exact condition these cards are in right now. Kathleen, you made the choice to stop early. Elizabeth, you stopped a little later. Elizabeth, you shuffled and cut. Kathleen, you didn't do either. But we could take this a step further. Elizabeth, you agreed to be here today. Kathleen, you created a symposium. You invited me. Kathleen and Elizabeth, you could have made different career choices, meaning this whole moment would not be happening right now. If somebody made a different choice out in the world, none of this would be happening right now. But here we are. All of these different life choices leading us to this one little moment where Elizabeth landed there and Kathleen landed there. Remember, something very different could be happening right now. But this is what's happening right now. And it kind of makes you wonder. Was it luck? Was it chance? Or was it fate?
Wow.
I will say, once you meet Kathleen, you can't say no to her ever. So
This is
it's
very
no
true.
chance, no fate. It's just like you're
This is very
in
true.
for
This is
life
very true.
with Kathleen. And I'm happy to be in. I mean, it's always interesting.
Yes, I'm very lucky to have both of you, for sure. That was brilliant, Kristen.
Thank you.
Love it.
You want just the one more?
Great.
The little send off?
Let's do it.
All right. Guessing game. Now, normally we do this in person. Normally I let you like squeeze the bag. I'll crumple it in the microphone so you can hear it.
Okay.
All right. Elizabeth, what do you think is inside this little package?
I don't know. Can you hold it up a little more? Huh. I think another cut up playing card, maybe. Maybe you're reusing.
Okay.
Reduce, reuse, recycle.
Okay. Kathleen?
Origami.
More origami. Does Chris have a guess in the background over there?
You have a guess?
Is it in the box?
Bath salts.
Bath
I thought
salt.
he was going to say toilet paper. I was like, God, do you have toilet paper? That's amazing.
That would
Where'd
be a
you get it?
miracle. That would be
He does magic, not miracles, people.
That's right. I can make elephants appear when you're not on the Zoom, but
Yeah,
toilet
but
paper,
not
a
toilet
possibility.
paper. No.
Let me show you. Come on out. Come on out.
Oh, it's a
Come
baby
on out.
mouse. Nice. Bourbon?
Cheers.
This, my friends, is a little cup of the spirits.
Yeah.
And I hope we took a few minutes to raise both of your spirits.
Yes.
Afternoon.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Yes.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Highlight of today's quarantine. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God.
Smooth.
So good, Kristen. I mean, I've seen you live. You're amazing.
Thank you.
When I saw that you could actually do this in virtual space, I was just floored. Like, I was like, how is anyone doing magic in virtual space? And you are absolutely amazing. I hope everybody hires you to do either a warm-up act or a closing act. I can't thank you enough for being a part of this, who can also give me heads up when you're like, it's not streaming. Like, you were very useful today.
I was like
multifunctional.
I was support. I was.
You were support in so many ways. And Elizabeth, thank you again so much. I've known Elizabeth. How long have we known each other?
I think since this case, that's how we first met. It was like 2006 or 7.
Yeah.
Kathleen calls me out of the blue, and then it turned out we had all these connections that we hadn't known about before.
Yeah.
Fate, chance.
Yes, all of that. I appreciate knowing you this long, and for you also coming out today, and for anyone who's still with us. Thank you very much. I am going to do my best to edit together something that doesn't seem to have all of the glitches. It'll seem seamless. But I appreciate it very much. Thank you both so very much.
Thank you, Kathleen, for your leadership on this.
Thank you. Have a wonderful
care.
rest of the day. All right.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks for the
Bye.
magic. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.